To talk about some of the famous forensic scientists. So forensic science was developed over decades by, maybe even centuries, by innovators in their field. And we're going to talk about some specific ones. But it's important to recognize that this idea of the modern age of science is relatively new. We think about science as being, centuries and centuries old, but it was really about the mid-19th century when it really became, this idea of modern science and applying principles, and it wasn't just philosophy. So this is still a fairly new field. Early 20th century is really when forensics became sort of much more prominent. So I have a variety of scientists that I want you to know their name and what their major contributions to the field is. But if you want to become a famous forensic scientist, basically you get famous by either developing an idea of how to apply science to their specific field. So in other words, how are they going to use this in a new way, or a technique, developing a technique that either to identify or to compare some physical evidence. So those are the major contributors. Let's go through them. I've listed them on the left side of the screen, but let's go through them a little bit at a time. So the first one would be, is really talking about the beginning of how to identify people. So, obviously suspects is really what we're talking about. So sort of having a database of people to be looking at when there's some suspicion of crime. And the first one was really Alphonse Bertillon. He was a French police officer, and he was the one who first devised a system of personal identification in the late 1800s using biometrics. We'll talk about that in a second. His specific field called the Bertillon system, or Bertillonage. The next one is Francis Galton, who really studied fingerprinting. He kind of was the first one to sort of study a variety of fingerprints and notice patterns and find a way to categorize and classify fingerprints so that you could say, well, this fingerprint is different from this one. And he also is the first one to really use statistics to determine what is the likelihood of a unique identification. So what is the possibility that this fingerprint could be wrongly assigned, that I say belongs to this person? What is the possibility that it could be wrong and it really belongs to another person? And that idea of statistics is very important in forensics in current day. A third one is Leon Lattes. I think that's how it's pronounced. So in other words, he didn't develop blood typing, but he was the first one to sort of say, I can use blood typing as a way to identify people. So that, not only saying, so in other words, if you have blood type A and the blood at the scene is blood type B, you're excluded from being a suspect. But also he developed a procedure for getting the blood type of dried blood on a dried blood stain at a crime scene. So he developed a method for testing blood type, and also was the first one to sort of come up with the idea of, but we could apply blood typing to using it as a way of identifying. So let's talk a little bit about that Bertillon system, Alphonse Bertillon's Bertillonage. So it's really also called anthropometry. And that's a system of, it's like measuring the human body. So he started coming up with ideas that, well, people are different in size, and we can use measurements of the body as a form of technique of identifying them. So, and he would actually create cards. So they would actually have like a gallery of rogues of different cards with these details about different suspects on them. So it was height, span, how wide is your chest from arm to your fingertip to fingertip when spread out, your head length and head breadth. I think I missed the chest height. That's the one where if you're sitting down in a seated position from the seat to the top of your head length and breadth. I'm looking at the right ear, and since the right ear differs from the left ear, you have to consistently measure the same ear. So it's right ear, left foot length, the middle finger length, the right cubic, which is your forearm from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. And then the mugshot was really his as well, the idea of a front-facing photo and a side-facing photo. So these cards were produced, and you can even see an example of a Bertillon card where you see all these measurements at the top. And he was able to sort of classify, it went further than this. We're classified by large, small, medium, and large sizes for these different things, to be able to classify people as into one of basically 2,000 categories, and that was helpful. So that was used for a long time at the beginning. Okay, so the next kind of groupings of people were people who learn to use physical science in investigation. So now we're applying, so that was just sort of measurements and identifying. Now we're actually looking at the evidence. So Hans Gross sort of started this idea of really sort of writing some ideas on how to put science principles to work in the criminal investigation, you know, how to use this emerging field of the scientific method. And Edmund Locard, really sort of built on that and then started to incorporate them into a specific crime lab, like saying, like, look, yes, it's nice to have a little book where you write that this is possible, but can we develop actual procedures for examining evidence? And we also can talk about Locard's exchange principle. So as you know, he came up with the idea of saying that if a criminal comes in contact with some object, there's going to be some transfer of something there. There's going to be oils, fingerprints, blood, fibers, something left behind. So in other words, there's some trace evidence left behind when a suspect touches something at a crime scene. And we say criminal, but it may not even be the criminal, right? Sometimes we have to identify who the victim is. And so using that idea of we can find what is left behind and use that for identification or matching to, you know, the criminal. And this is obviously something we use all the time in current analysis, is that, you know, we're looking at what was left behind at the crime scene and saying, therefore, this one must be the criminal. The field of microscopy is pretty important, you know, examining the microscopic examination of evidence, and there's a couple of people in this field. Walter McCrone is famous. There's actually a whole grouping. I think I know there's a website, but I think there's also like a school up in Chicago that's sort of named after him, using microscopy to examine evidence, and kind of came up with sort of not just how to use a microscope, but also sort of like procedures and sort of standard policies. Calvin Goddard came up with a comparison microscope. One of the problems is if you look at a microscope and you look at a piece of evidence and you're trying to compare it to another piece of evidence, and you have to like take the first evidence out and put the other one in and then focus it and everything, you're relying on your memory. Well, the comparison microscope actually has two separate microscopes that are combined into one field, so that it's cut in half. You can see this image in the lower corner, where you can see on the left would be one sample in one microscope, and on the right is the other sample. So one would be your reference sample and the other is the one from the crime scene, and you can do a direct comparison, so that's not relying on any memory. That's particularly important. So Goddard's comparison microscopy is a pretty big deal. And then Albert Osborne sort of developed this idea of document examination. Now sometimes they use microscopes or sometimes they use magnifying glasses, but the idea of examining documents, so I kind of put it in with microscopy. A couple more. We also had people who sort of came up with other ways to examine physical evidence. So Matthew Orfila is the father of forensic toxicology. Toxicology is about poisons in the body, and really, developed this as a field. It began with poisons in animals and how they affect animals. Again, this was the early science, and so there wasn't as much known about the effect on the human body, and the experimentation was done on animals. But again, this concept of being able to test what's left behind from the poisons in the body. And Albert Osborne, I already talked about him.